The Executive Lounge is empowered by Villa Monticello, Ghana's premium boutique hotel. Villa Monticello, your home of tranquility.
Is this something you learned? Were you born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Inshira Adam. Welcome to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Adam. This is your business leadership program that brings you insights and nuggets of wisdom from men and women who have scaled the daunting heights of growing businesses and managing people. Our guest today is a man who has demonstrated that over the years, and he's making a rare second appearance on the show. You remember him from season 1. Now, he's a serial entrepreneur who has distinguished himself in the fields of IT, media, telecommunications, and education in the Commonwealth of Independent States, as well as the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. He is the chairman of CMA Holdings, and they have representation through their portfolio countries, companies in about 22 countries. He is also the co-founder of the ABN Group, and that includes CNBC Africa, ABN Digital, ABN Training Institute, ABN Productions, ABN Pictures, ABN Education Trust, and also CNBC, as well as Forbes Africa. He's also the co-founder of Transnational Education and Lancaster University Ghana, Global Institute Middle East, and Tech One Global. He's maintained a remarkable core focus on long-term corporate leadership and development by ensuring that he selects the best of breed who can follow through with the vision. Let's welcome for the second time to the Executive Lounge, Mr. Rakesh Wahi. You're welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, in our previous conversation, you talked about your upbringing, having staff around the house, attending to the routine chores around the house, and so relatively you had a much nicer upbringing compared to most people. But there's a school of thought that children who go through that eventually become adults that tend to be slothful, adventurous, and they tend not to be entrepreneurial. How did you break the mold, if that thinking is true?
I don't necessarily agree with the thinking. I think it's very personal to families. It's a lot depends on how the parents bring up their children, and I think those are the core values that you get, and your identity is normally set by your parents, and you pretty much follow the values that they give you. In my case, my father was unduly strict with me. He was an army man himself, and little things that I remember from my childhood were even like going to places like the club. My sisters would be allowed to be driven by the driver, and I had to go on a bicycle because my father's direction to me was that as a man you need to make your mark, and therefore you need to earn your spurs, and you got to do everything from scratch. So he put a lot of expectations on me from my childhood, and I never took anything for granted. So I think that was basically the core that I grew up with.
So essentially, the way you want a child to turn out is largely dependent on what you put in place right from the beginning, and not so much the relative ease with which you raise them.
That's true, because if you let them get things very easy when they're young, they get used to the wrong things, and the desire to work hard just disappears over time, because they don't really have to aspire for anything. When my own children were growing up, I did the same. When my son, when he was 10 years old, he wanted a computer. I actually asked him to make a presentation and tell me why he needed it. And he had to sell the concept of why he wanted, PC for himself in his room. So, when you put those kind of basic values with your children, if you go back to the time when I was growing up, which was in the 70s, 60s and 70s, There were very few professions that were open where people aspired to become either engineers, doctors, and joining the armed forces was supposed to be a dumb thing. And since my father was with the Corps of EME, electrical mechanical engineers with the Indian Army, I always thought it would be a great career to follow. And so I applied for the National Defense Academy, and it's one of the toughest institutions in the world to get into. 400,000 kids apply every year, 10,000 are called for interviews, and 300 are selected. So I was, very happy when I actually made it almost to the top of that list.
The odds are really high on that.
Absolutely.
One. Yeah.
And so the grilling and the filtering process is very, very stringent.
How did life, pan out in the National Defense Academy? What was it like?
It's like any military training institution, like West Point or Sandhurst. You come in soon after school. And, so we graduated with a formal BSc or a BE, a Bachelor of Science degree. But the training regimen was very tough. What it instills in you is discipline. And I think the spirit de corps, where basically you go in with a lot of individuality, but when you come out from the other side, you come out as team players. And that's the core of what they try and establish in people, is that you're not alone. You have to work in teams. There's nothing known as leaving somebody behind. So when you go on camps, it's about the team coming together, and it's not about individualism. So I thought those were some of the basic values that they ingrained in you, and I think that's very important for every human being in today's world.
While in the Army, you joined the 7th Scientific Expedition to Antarctica. Is that when your bug for adventure was birthed?
The bug for adventure was more when I was in school. And, I went to a very prominent public school in India called the Doon School, and it has the greatest alumni in the world. Every term, we used to in midterm go out for, cycling expeditions or mountaineering and things like that. So I think that started much earlier, from the age of 10. However, the Army instilled a lot more of it. But in the Army, it wasn't so much out of adventure, it was more out of necessity. They had to toughen you up.
Okay.
And the Antarctic was more out of choice. I volunteered to actually go, and the Indian government had actually established a base in Dakshin Gangotri at the Antarctic. And I went with the team in the 7th expedition to build our second base there. So we spent 4 months on the continent, and I thought that was the most amazing time I've ever had in my life.
I could tell, because as soon as I mentioned it, I saw the glint in your eye. But what was it like, being out there in the cold? Paint the picture for someone like me who haven't seen it and probably not yet dreamt of seeing it.
So the two aspects to the journey, one is getting there, and a lot of people take shortcuts. They fly into the Antarctic. We went by ship, and it was an icebreaker. It was a Swedish vessel, and it took us about 22 or 23 days to get there. The most interesting time was, when you go through the roaring 40s and 50s or the furious 50s. It was like being in a 3D roller coaster for about 2.5 or 3 days. And very few people could actually keep anything in their stomach. Most of the people just stayed in their cabins and lay down. It was a tough period, those 3-4 days. But then as you cross 60 south, it's a different world there. The whole Southern Ocean is almost frozen. And you come into a tranquility zone that I had never ever experienced in my life.
Wow.
It was just, it was sublime. And then the Antarctic is like living in a refrigerator. It's, there's no infection, there's no viruses, there's nothing. It's cold, everything's frozen. so I don't think anybody ever got sick there. And I think it was one of the purest, kind of environments you can ever be in. So it was just I would say, phenomenal experience. We established our base about 110 kilometers from the continental shelf where we had berthed the vessel. And, we spent about 3 months building our base there. And in March of 1988, we, sailed back to India.
So you went in a company of men. What was the teamwork like? And what are some of the lessons you think you took away from that expedition?
The Antarctic was, like any expedition, it puts you to the, to the brink of your own endurance. So you'll find that, during whiteouts, there were times when we had high conditions of, close to hurricanes-like weather, and it was very difficult to even move around within the continent. I remember a particular day where we were in the underground shelter to go to the main base. To cover a distance of about 100 meters, it took us 4 hours because of the blizzard.
You did 4 hours, 100 meters
to
over a period of 4 hours.
Yeah, and you couldn't see beyond your nose. So they sent out a rescue mission to see where we were, and we were downwind. And this the rescue mission walked, about 20 meters away from us. We could see them, just the figures, and we could hear them. But we were shouting on the top of our voices, and they couldn't hear us.
Because you were shouting
downwind
into the wind.
And when there's wind velocity of 70 miles an hour, there's no way anybody can hear anything. And so, it's very difficult for anybody to experience it, except when you see movies, and you see some of these conditions. We actually lived through it. And you can actually empathize on how nature, and the human being has absolutely no chance against nature if you come down to the basics.
Wonderful. So beyond that, you were also given the is the
Vishesh Seva Medal.
Vishesh Seva Medal.
Yes.
Right. Now, tell us what the medal is for, and how you felt when it was awarded.
So I was amongst the youngest officers in the history of the Army, and I was on a classified defense works project. Can't talk too much more about it, but I guess it was recognition for the work that I did there. And the citation said, it recognized bravery beyond the call of duty.
That's good. So, well, you did the Antarctica, so I'm sure there was oodles of bravery in your system at that point. Yes. Any lessons from the Army at all, apart from teamwork and just essentially not leaving anyone behind and not doing anything just by yourself?
Well, I think the Army is a very fundamental career through which you understand how to achieve objectives. There is no soldier who does not identify with a higher mission in life. When you motivate people to give their lives for a cause, and sometimes they don't even understand the cause, it means that the level at which these people aspire to become is great. Serving soldiers basically understand objectives very clearly, and they understand how to put together the resources to achieve these objectives. So I think it's a very noble life. It requires a lot of discipline and dedication, and I have a lot of respect for people in uniform.
So if you had to do it all over again, would you still choose the Army?
Absolutely. I think that was the basis of what I am today.
Fantastic. Now let's delve into a bit of who you are now. People are important. There's a central point that you always seem to talk about, even in your book, Be a Lion, and I must say it's a really good read. In the book you mentioned how one of the leaders of, I think it's CNBC at the moment, who turned down the opportunity earlier when it was offered to be a head, but then later on came around to it. How do you see a good leader in the people you work with? How do you see that? What do you look for?
Well, I think, there's no one quality when you're looking for leadership qualities amongst people. It's somebody who has the empathy and the emotional intelligence to get the best out of a situation. And one of the core qualities of a good leader is to remain calm. So in addition to being able to analyze what you really want to do, what you want to achieve, your objectives, you should have a very basic quality of remaining calm under all circumstances, because whenever you're doing something in life, it's never going to be normal. There are things going to go wrong, whether it's economic, whether it's other issues, but you can't lose your cool. And you'll find that, leaders who often start shouting around and they panic, they create a sense of discomfort and insecurity in the minds of their people. It's again, I take you back to the battlefield, under fire. If a leader panics, the soldiers won't know what to do. And the same thing is in the corporate world. You have to remain calm. So I think the core of it is being able to analyze a situation, understand what you want to achieve, and put your objectives very clearly, and then put the right resources around you to lead into achieving that objective. And people then become the most important aspect of it.
How do you cultivate that empathy and emotional intelligence? Is this something you learn earlier in life, or it's something that can still be learned by an old dog?
I guess, a bit of it is inherent. You'll find that people who have a sense of humility generally would be able to learn quicker. People who lack a sense of humility will always be a little more difficult to pick up these qualities. You need to be able to empathize. There's always a second side to every coin. So when you're dealing with people, you need to have a lot of patience because circumstances are different from every human being, for every human being. And how they grow up, their backgrounds, how they react to situations needs to be understood. And when you're sitting in charge of a large number of people, there's no cookie cutter solution by which you can actually say that, look, one size fits all. You have to have the ability to see why people behave in a particular manner. Now, the only rule that I've always established is if there's a breach of integrity, then you have to be severe. Everything else can be improved. So over a period of time, I've always worked on trying to help people find their own feet, improve and grow. Where I put my foot down is if I find that there are some basic qualities of integrity that are violated.
Okay. Well, we're talking to Mr. Rakesh Wahi, a serial entrepreneur, and he's sharing his story and a lot of the lessons along the way with us. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll bring you more on the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Adam. Welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Adam, and today we're joined by serial entrepreneur, Mr. Rakesh Wahi. This is his second appearance on the Executive Lounge. You remember him from the first season, and he's dropped quite a lot of knowledge on us this morning, and we're going to be learning some more. Mr. Wahi, just before we went for the break, we talked about the things you look out for in a person that would be a leader in your organization. Now, in your time at in the Army, I'm sure there were people that you came across that did also recognize certain leadership traits in you. How important is that to the development of a person in your and from your own personal experience?
Well, I guess going back to the military, my first boss instilled a lot of fundamental qualities in me. He was a hard taskmaster, then Major Jagannathan, now Colonel, and he just instilled one basic value. He said, if there's a person out there working in the field, as an officer, you have to be there. So leading from the front was his diktat to us at all times. And as officers, you had to always be out there ahead of your troops. And I think that was the fundamental, kind of quality that I, aspired to then live with all my life. And I think that's the most important part of a leader. You cannot lead from behind. And I remember so many instances where even for the smallest of things, he would make sure that I was, out there in field. There were times when he didn't allow me to sleep. And, but when I look back, I think it was all worth it. But going to the next part of, the question that you had was the importance of people in general. And my fundamental belief is that people come into your life for a reason. You never take these things for granted. When somebody comes into your life, you got to really analyze why that's happened, and you got to take advantage of those situations. It doesn't matter if the person is more qualified or more powerful. It's that you are in the same time and space. It's like when people say, he was there at the right place at the right time.
That's right.
And but there were millions of other people at the right place at the right time as well. Why is it that they didn't succeed, and why is it that one person did? It's because that person took advantage of being there, built those relationships, took advantage of the environment that he was in, and worked hard to achieve it. So I think, and you cannot exist in this world alone. You will always grow in conjunction with others. And so in some instances, you would be helping them. In some, they would be helping you. It's complementary. So even within an organization, you may be the founder or the owner of the business, but it does not mean that the people who are working with you are lesser than you. They are actually working to build that organization with you. And therefore, they are as important and therefore you cannot look at it in the traditional sense of an employer-employee relationship. And that's why, over a period of time, I took away the word jobs from the organization. I brought in the concept of responsibilities. So you do not have a job, because jobs you can find anywhere. When you have a responsibility, it's like bringing up a child, particularly when you have a startup business. You cannot say that it's a 9 to 5. You have to have people who are committed to making sure that they fulfill their responsibilities. And responsibilities is 24/7.
This is basically getting the job done.
You have to get it
within
done.
a specific time.
Exactly, and there are times when you can take it easy. There are times when you got to work flat out.
Yeah.
And so that's basically what you try to imbibe in the people who work with you. And you have a very flat structure through which you operate. The more hierarchy you create in an organization, the worse it gets for you. So you got to make sure that people can get through to you quickly. You can get decisions quickly, and you have the people out there who will actually go out and then make sure that they implement everything that's being discussed.
Interesting. Now, in talking about people and their importance in meeting, your sister Sananda's husband Rajiv. So, what role did they play? Because somewhere in the book I read, that. They pretty much gave you your first break. How did that come about?
When I left the army, my father was in one of the most powerful positions in our country, and he was chairman of the ONGC, which is India's largest corporate, but it's a public sector business. And so when I left, I went to his office and he asked me, he says, "What do you intend doing?" And I asked him, I said, "I thought you would give me some advice." And he says, "Here's the advice." He says, "You will never come back to this office again." And he threw me into the deep end, and he gave me just one lesson then. He said, "Son, people are not going to be talking to you today because of who you are. Because as a captain with 9 years of service from the military, there's very little value you'll provide anybody. There are lots of people like you who are roaming around, looking for opportunity. The only reason they will talk to you is because of who I am. And don't have any misconceptions about it." And I made myself a promise that day, that I would never touch a single business that my father was ever involved with. Now, staying in India in that environment would have been very difficult for me, because it was a very prominent family name and people recognized it. With anybody in the corporate world, I would go to, they would see me because of who he was. But all conversations would get directed back into what he did. And I realized that, I had to break that from that shackle. And my sister was based in Dubai. I was talking to her about what I was going through, and she and her husband said, "Look, we got a small media business here. Why don't you come and give it a shot and use a little bit of time in trying to understand what you want to really do with your life." So I moved to Dubai and then went on to Russia and made a life for myself from there.
Interesting. Working with your sister and her husband in that small media business. What did that teach you? Because I believe they were doing a business directory at the time. That's very niche.
So they did a lot of below-the-line publishing, and so I went in and started managing a sales team, selling advertising sales at the age of 29. And I spent a year there, trying to understand what the media business was all about. But at that time, the Soviet Union was opening up, and if you remember, Perestroika started in '89, and there were a lot of my school friends who encouraged me to actually put together a pool of money and look at Russia as an opening market. So I spent about a year with my sister's business, but then the first Gulf War broke out.
That's right.
And the markets went into a turmoil, and I had to find something else. So when you set out, things don't always fall into place the way you plan them.
That's true.
And so I went into a bit of a cycle then. It wasn't easy. When I left the army, I had $500 in my pocket, and that's what I started with. And so I went off to Russia, and that's where the real entrepreneurial side of my life started.
How did you find that? Was it through a very fiery furnace, or it was one of those moments of, "Oh yeah, I got it"?
I guess you never have a moment where you say I got it. It's as you go out to places, you understand the culture, you understand the people. And if you take the time to understand these basic fundamentals, you will be successful. It may take a little longer, but I think you have to understand how business is done in that environment. You cannot go in with solutions from the outside or take experiences from the outside and say, "This is how we're going to do things in Russia," or in any other emerging market, for instance. So it was about going and building relationships. Though this was a time when very few people spoke English in Russia. There was no banking system. In fact, they were still using the abacus in banks, those marbles to calculate. So it was a very unstructured way of life. And, I was just fortunate that I met the right people there. We invested a little bit in real estate. We got involved with a few other businesses which did well. And the first 3-4 years, the more difficult an environment, the more controlled it is, the better it is for an entrepreneur, because the risk reward is high. And perhaps at that time I didn't really understand what risks I was dealing with. Coming out of the army, the only thing I was fearless. I could actually travel anywhere and take on any personal hardship. But I didn't really understand the business side of things very well. So perhaps I took decisions at that time which could have also got me into trouble.
Right.
Investing without knowing people, well enough, without doing adequate due diligence in certain cases. But they just turned out to go in my favor. I was just lucky, I think. And so I think luck plays a very important role. And when you look back in life, a lot of people talk about their vision and how they've managed to create wealth and value. But very few people really talk about this huge issue of lady luck. And I don't think you can ever discount it. You just have to be very, very lucky, when you're doing businesses in emerging markets. It has to play to your advantage.
Let's jump into emerging markets for a moment. A lot of your work has been in emerging markets. Would you say that the Russia experience played a role in helping you sniff out opportunities in emerging markets?
Well, I guess it's when you get exposed to a market like Russia and you've had the experience of actually seeing the value creation that can take place, because going into developed countries, it's far more competitive, it's more structured, and so the opportunity to actually build something may not be there, because there are a lot of other people there who are actually doing much better than you in that space. Whereas when you go into highly risky areas, and I put CIS, including Africa, into the same basket. Not many people are prepared to go and live there. Not many people are prepared to be patient in those markets. So I think that's where the opportunity comes for people who are really looking out to go and build something substantive. And so that's the selection that I took. The only caveat that I put for myself over time was that we would take global brands into emerging markets, so you wouldn't take a brand risk in anything you did. So that's the model that I developed in 2002, and we started then partnering with well-established businesses or business brands, but taking those into countries that they weren't represented in.
Very interesting point. So if you would look back at taking risk and apart from being fearless and all the lessons, juxtapose that to the Ghanaian space. Now, we've heard the Africa Rising, rhetoric for some time now. Some people are quite concerned that it's just a rhetoric and that's all. And others also think that it's because the African generally is risk averse. Africa presents a great potential for growth, in my humble opinion. That said, what must we do to be able to take on opportunities and execute them to the very end?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to, look at the perspective of Africa the way it is as a continent. People who are in a hurry shouldn't be here. So the first lesson that I give to people is be patient. When you come from a country like India, growing up in India sets very low expectations in terms of what the government does for you or the infrastructure or anything else, because it's not an easy place to live. So the hardships you endure in an economy like India prepares you for what you would see in other parts of the world, particularly in emerging markets. And I just think that Africa is not as bad as it's made out to be. There's a lot of transparency coming into different aspects of governance in the continent. So when I came here in 2004, things were a lot different, and it's a lot different 13 years hence. So we need to recognize that things are changing, maybe at different pace in different countries, but it's happening. There is, people talk about democracy, and democracy is a very relative term. There are developed countries where it's also not working. If it, but what is happening in countries in Africa is that it works. If you look at certain economies where there's continuity of leadership, people remain happy there. The economies are growing on double-digit rates. So I think we need to rationalize the opportunity and the realities of ground and look at it in the long term. So that's the first lesson that you give to people.
That's right.
Now the second issue is about risk. Risk is something that is inherent, it comes as an inherent quality. It's not that people in Africa don't take risks. It's some people don't take it and some do. People who don't take risks are generally, it again goes back to your basic value system. It depends on, the culture and the background that you come from. People who tend to have not had a lot would not want to risk. But on the other hand,
that's right, okay.
But on the other hand, because you want to actually make sure that you insulate yourself, because that is every person's first priority, is how do I insulate myself, how do I insulate my family. So even when you have money in your bank, not everybody goes and puts it into equities. You'll first put it into secure bonds and into fixed deposits where you know that this money is not going anywhere. When you then go to phase 2 of your investment philosophy, you'd start looking at equities, because now you say, look, I've got my basics sorted out, but let me now take a little bit of risk. So that's the way life also pans out for people. You tend to make sure that you first want to insulate your basic needs, and then you look beyond. On the other hand, there would be entrepreneurs who come up with great ideas when they're young, and you can't compare that with the average person. You could have a moment of brilliance where you come up with a spark where you say, look, this is going to be the next great thing in the continent. And so you've got some great success stories of young entrepreneurs in Africa who've done exceedingly well. So I think you can't put everything, it's a mixed bag. You can't throw everything in and say that, look, we are generally risk averse. I've seen some phenomenal risk-taking abilities with Africans as well. And it varies from country to country in terms of how the legislation has evolved, how the economies are changing, and I generally feel that this is where I would like to spend the rest of my time. I have one son; he's based in Africa, and we think that this is the greatest part of the world to be in today's millennium.
Wow, this is where it's all happening for you.
Yeah.
That said, I'm curious to learn about what an aspiring serial entrepreneur should do. Where are the low-hanging fruits of opportunity that we can go after?
Well, I guess there's so much opportunity. When you go to a country like Nigeria, you just look at from the time you get off at the airport till the time you get to your hotel on Victoria Island. There's opportunity you see at every cross-section. And you find that Nigerians are amongst the most entrepreneurial people in the world. If there's no power, somebody will be selling water. And so I think, the low-hanging fruit are regional in terms of, what the opportunities are. Principally, I think the area where there's a shortcoming is access to capital. That's an area where I think a better structure needs to be formed within the African economies. Right. Entrepreneurs don't get, they're not successful because they don't have the access to, and this is where the difference comes between developed countries and developing countries, that you don't have a well-structured venture capital business or, people who would come in and help you when you have an idea. So I think, and this is where as an entrepreneur, your journey is a very interesting one. When you set out, you don't have much to offer to anybody, because when you bring a business plan to somebody, everybody has a hockey stick kind of projection saying that, look, this is going to be the next Google or right. Great thing that you can think of, and you don't have a track record behind you, but you want to actually go from A to Z without actually the rest of the alphabets.
That's right.
Now, this journey is very important. Is about building credibility. And for entrepreneurs, I think the lesson I give to the younger generation is don't be in a hurry. Take your time building your credibility, because credibility and trust are not words. These are values that everybody's watching. Whether it's your bankers, whether it's your staff, whether it's your service providers, everybody is looking at you and saying, is this man somebody who's going to keep his word? And over your lifetime, people start supporting you only when they know that what you say is what you're going to do. And once that starts getting established and that credibility gets established, then you don't have very far to look. Every time you come up with an idea, people come in and back you because they know that you've got a history of success behind you or credibility behind you. So that is, I think, what you need to build. And the same goes to the people you work with. Building trust is not a word. It's not a switch. You can't, say, please trust me. It's consistent actions over a lifetime where people know that when you say something, you mean it and you will execute it. Or at least you will die trying. And so that basically is the core of any entrepreneurship. So I think, is being patient and looking at things in the long term. There's another very important aspect in this conversation around entrepreneurship is that of freedom. A lot of people say, I want to start my own business because I want to be free. I want to get away from the shackles of employment. But the truth is not further from, this entire conversation. Yeah. When you get into being an entrepreneur, that word freedom actually goes out of the window.
Yes.
You are never going to be free again because you've now undertaken something where you actually have a responsibility of more people than you actually had before.
That's
Earlier,
true.
you were only worried about yourself, your family.
Little work profile that you were given. That's right.
And now you suddenly have 100 people, sometimes 1,000 people, and then maybe even more depending on your business. You got to make sure that they get paid on time. You got to, those pressures are completely different. So from something that you could actually do from 9 to 5, you end up living
for 18, 22 hours a day.
And if not more. So I think you are all in when you go into being an entrepreneur. You cannot say that I'm going to do this part-time so that sense of responsibility is very important. The other aspect is managing your own expectations very carefully. You'll find the younger generation, particularly what I see these days, is that they want everything in a hurry.
The microwave mindset.
They want basically, I want to have a Rolls Royce, I want to have cars, I want to have this, fancy lifestyle. That comes over time, and that's not important either. You can't, go out and raise money and have somebody invest in your business, and the first thing they see is that you've bought a big house and you've, got 6 cars. That's not what an investor wants to look at.
Yeah.
So I think, it's managing your expectations, which is very important for the younger generation. You've got to actually make sure that you first deliver the promises that you set out to your stakeholders, and then you look at your lifestyle. And that, you can't put the cart before the horse and say that, look, I'm going to actually do this the other way around.
Yeah. Doesn't work that way.
No.
All right, more knowledge up ahead, and we're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll get into some more interesting parts of the entrepreneur's mindset and then the philosophy that entrepreneurs must live by. And also the lessons that you've learned, because I'm sure somewhere along the line you've had your fingers burnt a few times, and there are some lessons for us to learn. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Shira Ado, and we're in the final leg of our conversation with our guest today, Mr. Rakesh Wahi. Just before we went for the break, we were talking about the things that are very important to the success of any entrepreneur in an environment like Ghana or any emerging market. One of the things I've observed is that there are businesses that tend to start well in emerging markets and are unable to stand the shocks and eventually they collapse or they get bought out. How do you ensure that you build in the right contingencies to see the business thrive? I mean, you've been in Ghana and in this sub-region for at least 13 years. How have you been able to do that?
Well, I can give you 2 examples. I think that's the best way to validate some of these theories. When we launched our education business in Dubai, we set up a university there in academic collaboration with Murdoch University. And as soon as we launched, we were hit by the worst global recession in 2008. And if you remember, there was a complete financial crisis around the world. Nobody really knew. This was unprecedented. Nobody knew how to react to it. We didn't know where the bottom's going to be. And we started a university with 39 students, and we were burning about $350,000 a month to sustain it. And my partner Zafar Siddiqui and we actually looked at each other and said, look, have we made a mistake? Because this was our first foray into education, and we seem to have made a mistake right up front. So I think you need to go back to the drawing board and relook at what is it that you really want to achieve in that business, and go back to the core of it and take all the frills out. And we focused on 4 pillars of education that we wanted to actually build our reputation around. And we took everything else out of the equation and consolidated the business. Over the next 3 years, between 2008 and 11, we were one of the only universities that actually as a startup survived in Dubai. A lot of them shut down, consolidated, things like what you were talking about, but we managed to go through. And one of the key ingredients of this was about people. We had the right team with a can-do attitude, never gave up, and they rolled up their sleeves and worked 24 hours a day to make sure it happened. And the same thing happened, when we had another startup business in Africa at that time, which was CNBC Africa. We launched, and lo and behold, in 2008, everything went belly up in terms of the economies. And the first thing that gets hurt in an economic crisis is advertising.
Yes.
Most companies hold back, and we had the same issue. We had a very aggressive growth strategy into Africa. We immediately consolidated the business and said, look, let's wait it out and see how we're going to deal with. So we looked at what is it that was going to be core to the business. And we have pulled through the last 10 years, despite the fact that we had a very, very shaky start, and a lot of people at that time were skeptical about our ability to survive. So I think the main thing that comes out of these lessons is the ability, firstly, of the team to pull it together, and you have the right people around you with a very positive attitude. The second very important aspect is supporting shareholders. Your shareholders must understand that you're in the business for the long term. I had somebody from the IFC asked me a question the other day about our education business, saying, what's your exit strategy? And I said, I have none. We will not exit this business because I see this as a business for 50 and 100 years. It's definitely not going to happen on my watch. What my children choose to do is very difficult for me to respond to at this stage. But we are looking at all our businesses in the long term. So there's nothing short term for us. It's not that you want to cash your money and leave in a hurry. So you've got to actually take a very different view when you're in emerging markets. You've got to actually look at things in the long term and be ready to slog it out and go back to basics when the chips are down. And you're going to have these problems. It's not, they're going to be legislative changes. They're going to be economic upheavals. South Africa is going through its own problems these days. Right. You've got Nigeria, which is in the doldrums right now because of exchange controls. And yet you've got to, continue, despite these problems. And I think that's where the resilience of businesses come in, that, you've got to have a long-term view, got to remain calm in crisis, and make sure that you put the right resources around it. So I think these are some very important qualities, particularly having the right attitude at all times.
But you would agree that people are at the core of this, because it turns out that since you started, you've not lost a single member of your senior management. How are you able to get that level of loyalty and dedication to the cause?
One of the things over the years that I've done is I've delegated almost entirely. So I don't sign a single piece of paper in any of my organizations. I don't handle any bank account. So I have actually created a culture of delegation. There is a lot of accountability within the system. So we do have checks and balances. We've got very strong internal audits and processes. So it's not that you've let go of the control of things, but you've given adequate responsibility to your senior team to execute. And that's the only way people will thrive, because if you micromanage senior people, they're not going to stay. You have to be able to give them a sense of empowerment where they feel that they can take the decisions. Now, they will make mistakes over time. And when you're building an organization across 20, 30 countries, you can't be omnipresent, you can't be everywhere. And therefore, you have to accept in your mind that there will be certain things that will go wrong. You also have to have a culture where making mistakes should not be frowned on. Mistakes will be made. People who don't make mistakes are not human in the sense, or they're not doing their work. Things will go wrong. So you also have to be able to quantify what is the reason why those mistakes are being made. Look at the intent behind it rather than just the action. And if you look at the intent, you'll always find that people are not trying to do things to make mistakes. They happen, as long as they don't repeat it. And so that's the culture that I've established again in the organization, that make your mistakes if they are to be made. It's not that you encourage that somebody should go out and make a mistake, but it does happen over a period of time. You choose the wrong vendors, you've been misled by people, you've made wrong determinations in markets. But all these things will happen as long as there's no integrity being involved in the process. And I've been lucky to have some very strong people that have joined forces with me over the period of my lifetime. And we've worked together, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Asia. We've just stayed together, and we've been through a lot of ups and downs, and we're still together and trying to make it happen.
People again. What are the lessons you'd say have shaped your own philosophy that you distilled from some of these interactions you've had over the years?
Well, I guess I coined a phrase in the organization which is called LIACC, which is LIACC, and these are, I think, the core values that I look at. The first is loyalty. It's not necessarily in that order, but of importance, but they're all important. So loyalty, attitude, integrity, competence, and commitment. And if people have these 5 qualities, you'll find that you will be successful, because they are going to be committed to the organization and to its long-term success.
So loyalty, attitude,
integrity,
competence, and
commitment.
So a commitment to the cause. But these are things that you don't find in one place at the same time. And so how are you able to get the culture adopted by these new people when they join the organization, to the extent that they're able to exhibit this at every turn?
So the first is that you need to be able to exhibit them yourself. A relationship with your team is not a one-sided relationship that you're talking down to them and they keep quiet. You have to exhibit these qualities yourself. And if you exhibit them, people learn from what you're doing. They look at and aspire to be what you're exhibiting. And over a period of time, you'll find that loyalty begets loyalty, integrity begets integrity. If you're positive, your people will over time become positive. If you're capable, you will make sure that people around you are capable. If you're committed, they will be committed. So you're not setting expectations for anybody, which is not what you're prepared to do yourself. So it goes back to my first point of leading from the front.
Wonderful. Final point on people. In dealing with people, in the book you said, look, no one comes your way by accident. They come to either teach you life's bitter lessons, or they come to help you get to the next level, essentially just help you along. What are some of the experiences that you would say you got your fingers burnt, and the lessons that you learned from that?
I guess, going back to the way I was brought up, my parents instilled a fundamental value that people inherently are good. And you should go into relationships looking at the positives. So my belief is that if you get 51%, and I go with the rule of 51 at all times, that if you get 51% in a relationship, it's better than the 49. You can improve the 51 and take it to 60 and 70 and 80. If something goes below the 51, then, and that's typically when some basic values are being infringed. So one is the fundamental belief that people are inherently good. But then there are some lessons that you also got to remember, that opportunity makes a man a thief. And the mistakes I've personally made over time have largely been where you have taken a passive role or an over passive role in a business opportunity, where you've actually set something up geographically very far away, or in a regulated environment where you don't have the necessary controls or the legislation. And so we had an investment in Ukraine in the 90s, and we didn't have any control over the people there. And at one point, when I used to travel there, I could see that the business was flourishing. There was a lot of money being generated. My lawyers and my people on ground told me that, look, the business is doing exceedingly well. But the partners had the wrong intent. And it was largely because I wasn't there. So I think one of the lessons that I've learned, which I then try and make sure that I don't fall prey to again, is the fact of doing things by remote. And it's a big lesson for entrepreneurs that you must be hands-on in what you're doing. You must have a feel for what's going on ground, and don't leave everything in the hands of somebody else, because at some point people's own intentions change, and that's largely because you've allowed that to happen.
Now, tell me, what is Rakesh Wahi's big, audacious, hairy goals for the next 10 years?
I guess we are focused largely on the development of education in Africa. It's a very important sector to my mind. I think if you just look at from a macro level, the population in Africa is going to get to 2 billion over the next 30-40 years.
That's right.
You're going to have the youngest population. Today, roughly about 500,000 or 600,000 Africans go to developed countries for their tertiary education. Now, there's a leakage of about $15 to $20 billion a year on this education. There's a very strong middle class in Africa that can afford the same education, but if it's provided in situ in Africa. So our model is basically bringing these global brands. We brought Lancaster. We are currently in conversations with the University of Aberdeen. It's a 500-year-old university, and we want to bring in a center of excellence for energy into East Africa. And we got other partnerships that we're looking at in Southern Africa and in South Africa when the legislation changes. So our focus is largely going to be on creating higher education businesses. But there's a bigger value that I've been working on, and this leads basically into the involvement of youth. It's a big mission for me now, is to actually integrating youth into our structures. You cannot have the young generation absent from your boardrooms. And that's the culture that I'm changing in the organization, because we are living in a very disruptive world today. And the ideas that you get from the younger generation, my son joined the business when he was 25 or 24. And when I sit with him, his view on the media business is very different than mine. And if we are to be able, and if the consumers are going to be his age group, then I need to listen to him.
That's right.
Rather than think about what I have in my head, because what I have are very old ideas. So bringing those ideas from a younger generation is very important into the long-term survival of our businesses. And this is not just in media, it's in education, it's anything we do. Because this level of disruption that we're going to go through is going to be so significant that people don't understand it yet. And your businesses are going to become irrelevant if you don't change. So the ability to be nimble and change is very important as businesses as we go forward. And in Africa, the advantage is that you can leapfrog all these ideas, because you're sitting with brick and mortar businesses in the developed world. Right. Whereas over here, you can invest into the future. So when I'm setting up a university, we actually currently acquiring land in Ghana to build our own campus. Now we have the ability now to look at what a modern university is going to look like. And this is not necessarily classrooms in the way you see them in the old universities. You will have seating in clusters. You have smart boards. It's a social experience. You provide bandwidth to the students. It's going to be a different way of learning. Now, is it going to be online all the way? I don't think so. I think education can never become 100% online, because the social interaction is very important. So this blended learning, if you create an environment where you've provided the technology and the needs for students, and they come in and blossom in an environment that is conducive to learning, is what this business is going to be all about. When I used to walk into my daughter's room when she was in high school, she used to be watching television. She had all these gadgets open in front of her, and I'd ask her, "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" And she says, "Dad, I'm studying." Now there's something wrong with this picture. But if your child is getting straight A's, it means they're consuming information in a manner that we weren't used to. We are a textbook generation.
That's right.
But the generation of tomorrow is completely different.
Taking them from multiple sources and processing.
Exactly, and very quickly. So, we needed log tables and slide rules to calculate. They don't need all of this. They've got some basic tools that are available that allows them to leapfrog their learning process itself. So that's a very important aspect of it. And then finally, I think, as a family, we are very focused on giving back. It's a very important aspect, I think, for any entrepreneur. That as you keep building businesses, you need to contribute back into the environment in which you are setting up your businesses. So we have set up a foundation in South Africa. Our focus is twofold. We are looking at tertiary education for children from previously disadvantaged homes. And then we're looking at the girl child, which is very important, not just in the orphanages, but in general, working towards the upliftment of women. This issue of gender equality is a big talking point. People, discuss it everywhere, but I find that, there's a lot of difference between the concepts, the discussions, and the actual implementation of it. So we are actually taking all the steps to make sure it happens. In fact, we put our money where our mouth is. 50% of my senior management today are women. 50% of our staff currently in Africa are women. And we're making sure that we drive that agenda very hard, because you have to get that participation in order. And so these are some of the things that, we're working hard to make sure that we achieve.
Yeah. One of the things I must say I've observed is that when you were talking about the vision and the plans, the glint in your eye was similar to recounting the Antarctica experience and the time in the army. I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Mr. Rakesh Wahi, for making time to talk to us for a second time on the Executive Lounge.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
It is for us as well. As always, when we're ending, we share with you 5 things I've picked out from the conversation so far. Now, if you want to build a successful business, you must first of all work at being patient. Don't go in and think that you're going to get the yields overnight. You must be in it for the long haul. And the next thing you have to do is to remember that you don't meet people by accident. You meet people and they will teach you a thing or two. Even your terrible experiences will help you avoid other ones in the future. So meeting people is essentially an important part of doing business and doing it successfully. And the third thing you also have to do is to ensure that the people that you surround yourself with will have the ingredients that make it work. And Mr. Wahi calls it LIAC. It says loyalty, attitude, integrity, competence, and commitment to the cause. It's important that you're able to find these things in the person that you're working with. And the fourth thing is you will make mistakes. They will happen. Accidents will happen. You will fall. But if you focus on getting to the end of the cause, then you dust yourself and you start over again. Go to the basics and look at what you can take out and consolidate, but keep going forward at all costs. And the final thing is this: dream, and dream big. Make it adventurous. Just go on an adventure. Who knows? You might build an enduring business that will touch lives that you'll never see. This has been another edition of the Executive Lounge. We'll be back again soon. And thank you to the production team, led by Kukwapia and Villa Monticello, for provision of the set. See you. Go forward. Make rain. Is this something you learned when you were born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Inshira Adam.
The Executive Lounge is empowered by Villa Monticello, Ghana's premium boutique hotel. Villa Monticello, your home of tranquility.